It's YNK, so since I stole all of Thorin's gigs, at the very least, what you guys can do is subscribe to his YouTube channel, so go on and do it right now.
Janko, aka YNK, has joined MiBR made in Brazil as their new coach. Obviously, this is a core that hasn't had a coach since way back when Zeus, who's now with Team Liquid, was with them. His last tournament being ESL 1 Cologne, where they were able to win their second major, going back to back. Since then, they've never won another major. They had a very successful 2017, but even then, within a certain context, there were some big moments that they failed. Obviously, 2018's been a nightmare. They've made roster moves that simply have not worked. They've continued to descend, and the level they've capped out at, I think actually they've somewhat been propped up by the fact that while the Tier 2 scene and the low end of Tier 1 is very competitive, you've got the elite teams, you've got some pretty good teams, and then there's a big drop-off between like the bottom of Tier 1 and the teams that are the contenders' dark horses. You have all these teams there, and so they've just managed, by virtue of winning a few matches here and there, not big ones generally, to stay afloat, stay top 10, stay 5, 6, 7, 8, that kind of range. But if you actually look at the way they're playing and you look in past years, they haven't actually been a team worthy of a 5, 6, 7, 8 slot in the world when you consider some of the more competitive periods of time in terms of the top end of the scene and the balance of elite teams like contenders, dark horses, solid squads. There's been a little bit of leeway there that I think's propped up their rankings in spite of their terrible results. So in terms of Janko becoming the coach of MiBR, I think MiBR is a team that has needed a coach. Now more than ever. I think even more so now that they've got Tarek in the door, because now it's not even like they can blame it on Bolts and say he's underperforming or he doesn't fit the role anymore or he's lost his confidence. Now in theory they've got all these players who are supposed to be self-driven, former stars of teams, very talented players. So with all these clear talents in their team, but no coherent approach to using them seemingly, having this disjointed sense of identity, or rather lack of identity, amongst not only most of the players in their roles, they've swapped a lot of things around, but the team in general doesn't have that cohesive, stylistic approach, identity. I mean, it does in a sense, it's just bad, but it's not successful, it's not efficient, it's not able to make use of all that fabulous talent. They're actually, not even on that much of a higher level, but it's somewhat reminiscent of what's going on in NIP right now. Like, you're confused about what's going on with the in-game leader role, map pool's entirely disjointed, like generally the old stars aren't playing like the old stars, but then you've brought in new talent, but talent that used to be stars elsewhere, so do they just slot into supportive roles? Do they play as stars? And so you look at the NIP squad and you go, this is a pretty solid team in terms of talent, right? And then the results are non-existent. Now, yes, MiBR, formerly SK, their results have been a little bit better than NIP's, but it's kind of the same story. Like, they're actually incredibly underwhelming and underperforming for the talent level that they have. So with that much talent, bringing in a coach and someone who can kind of figure out how to help these players play the right way and find their roles could be a massive game changer without having to necessarily do a roster move. I think it's especially notable how far MiBR has fallen, even in terms of not just the style and the lack of understanding of how to use their players, but if you just look at their map pool, they've looked lost in their map pool. They've looked scared in their map pool. They haven't seemed like a team that actually felt like they even had 3 or 4 solid maps. Never mind having like 1 or 2 world-class maps, then like 3 or 4 that we can flex between, depending on who they're playing. They've had a couple of maps. They've tried to make things like DOS 2 work. They tried to work some of the other maps in the pool, and they've still had the raw talent to sometimes get wins on maps, like your Mirages, etc. But generally, it's been pretty woeful, and you can tell from the way they pick the maps and the way they play them, they don't feel comfortable in them themselves in the roles that they've been assigned, collectively, because they didn't have a coach, or by Fallen, within the squad. So in terms of Janko, obviously, he is most famous as an analyst. Late 2015, he came along, he was coming on the desks with me and Richard. At the time, we had a different cast of characters on there. Obviously, very quickly rose up the ranks, I think by about maybe mid-2016, I think he was already the best by then. He still had to work on some things of showmanship and presentation, polish some of the rough edges off his accent, but he's done all of that. He's absolutely at the top of the game right now, maybe a little burned out sometimes, which is why maybe this role makes a lot of sense. But quite frankly, Here's the thing. For me personally, I mean, to be fair, I will say this. I've never done full-time as an analyst. Like, I did sort of in 2015, but from 2016 on, I've consciously taken breaks, turned events down, been in a position where I didn't want to do that as my only job in the world because it's very stressful. The travel time really burns you out. And you don't want to just do one thing all the time. So fair play. A couple of years, he's gone. He's got that Skrilla. He's built his reputation. He's been the number one guy. He's accomplished a lot in the game. Now, what I was going to say was, personally, if I'm number one in that type of a position, I probably wouldn't give it up. Like, generally, if I do something, it's because I enjoy it and I want to keep doing it. If that's not the case for him, though, if he's burned out at all by it, or he just thinks he wants to try something new, try a new challenge in life, I totally get it. Not least because the style of analysis Janko liked to do, where he wanted to break down a lot of rounds, he wanted to talk about key plays and rounds that changed the game, he wanted to talk about the build-up to key rounds, and then he wanted to kind of like give analysis even of intricate plays, smokes and flashes within a round. That is actually not very suited for the current climate of what we do in CSGO. Some tournaments, people only have a couple of minutes to get their point across, and they maybe get one turnaround or a turnaround and then a bit of throwback. Some events, like like when I did the E-League Major and some of the E-League TV broadcasts, you literally would get 30 seconds each. Now that gives you no time for nuance, depth, the kind of detail that Janko wants to go into. And so while some tournaments gave him, until recently, somewhat gimmicky Weatherman segments where he could walk over and show one round and show you a few smokes, and fair enough, ESL1 Clone gave you a bit extra in terms of time and ability to do that, and it gave you more options in terms of the tools that they used. I do think that he was very underutilized. Like, I think that events really should have been figuring out with this guy, not just having a dedicated segment after big matches where he broke down 2 or 3 rounds and having a pre-game where he has his segment that maybe is pre-planned, so you know exactly how long it's going to be, where he breaks down the game, gives you like a key player to watch and kind of a heat map, what he's going to do in the game and how you can counter it, show you like a video of another game that they played in. Look, we'll pause it here, they've put pressure on him here and they've got someone flanking, the flashes come in, the AWP has to move back. You know, this is the sort of shit, like think about like NFL Network, you think about NBA games, how much time they have to build up to a game, really like immerse you in all the details of the history of it and all the context and mechanisms of how the players play. Then after the game, break down what he did correctly. This is the sort of stuff we should have been doing with this guy. Shoulder content, more time, a dedicated role, his own tools to work with. We didn't, sadly, because as great as CSGO events have gotten, I still think they're some of the best in the world. Unfortunately, we don't get the kind of time to analyze and break down the game that something like Dota does. We definitely don't get anything approaching what real sports gets. I mean, I was watching, this isn't even talking about pure analysis, but I was watching the ESPN post show for the Overwatch League Season 1 final, and they had like a 22-minute post-game segment. Now, a lot of that was my style of analysis. It was like narrative, it was talking about which players, what it means for their careers, like what were your expectations coming in, what did we see in the game, what were some of the key content, key factors. It was a lot of punditry, a lot of talking heads, again, my style of stuff. But if you'd have used those 20 minutes and you'd have done that for like the post-game of a major final, and you'd have had Janko in there breaking down FaZe versus Cloud9 from 15-11 onwards, and then looking at some of the force, it would have been fucking fantastic. You'd be remembering now more of the game than you can remember. You'd know much quicker some of the key moments that were able to shift the game. And especially if you gave it actually more of a shoulder content aspect where, like a real sport, maybe even has like an hour after the game, so you can properly go through the match, pick out his rounds, etc. And therefore, he's not just analysing from memory and from things that's happened to stand out in the moment, mixed with emotion, seeing the game live. He can go back and do it all. So I do think he was underutilised in that sense, just as I've complained many times about the pick ban phase being incredibly short in CS, and therefore I don't get to do some of the things I would like to do, quoting off stats, telling you some of the things, what's changed in the matchup recently, what happened last time. I don't have time for all that. I've got 2 seconds before it goes to the next ban or the next pick, don't I? I've got to just kind of tell you, yep, expected this, big room for them. Obviously, they'd just be bigger. Oh, we're coming in with the next one. Like, this is one of the things that I think a lot of the analysts actually feel like, as great as it is that day rates have gone up, conditions are much better, we have to work less, so we get to focus on our time. There's not more time in the segment, there's not more tools to use, and sometimes I know people feel as though, I had so much I could have said about that, so much I could go into, and I only got a little bit of time, and then you had to cut me off because we had to go into a segment with ads, or we had to go into an interview, or it's just the end of this segment and the next game's coming up and everyone's swapped out the old flash drives. So in that kind of world, I kind of get why he might want to go and give something like this a try, especially because this is kind of an all-in move briefly, however long he's going to be there. Because what you're doing is you're sort of saying, I'm not just going to dabble with this. I'm going to go all in. I'm going to try and be a great coach. I'm going to try and do great things with this team. Then we'll see where it lands and if it's a long-term gig. But I'm really kind of wiping everything clean. I'm setting the filters on this as my goal, become the best coach. It's not about just pure analysis generally and entertaining people. It's about getting the right tactics. It's about figuring out what I need to change about this guy's role or tweak about it or how to give him more confidence or explain to him his responsibilities so it takes away a certain fear. I mean, I know Janko's a guy who loved that quote. I remember it was I think it was a Coach Quotes Twitter tweet, which I actually retweeted, and he was like, that's such a sick quote. And I remember he used it on a broadcast where it was the one that was something along the lines of in a game, you don't rise to the moment, you sink to the level of your preparation. So I know he's a guy who really believes in you've got to put in the hours, in the theory, in the practice, in execution. You've got to think about all these things. You've got to work with players, and that's how you're going to get out of him. So I will say, when I've talked to many of my colleagues who are analysts, obviously this happened to me as well, there's a fairly long history of players initially seeming like they're jokingly saying, haha, you're going to come and help us with some analysis or work with us or maybe be our coach. And what you actually find when you talk to some of them is some of the owners will just outright say, listen, I'd hire you today if you want to do it. Some of the players, it's more like they're testing the grounds. They're saying, would you actually be open to it? Would you be open to at least do it? Because it's actually quite a common thing that if we're at after parties or it's in your Twitter DMs or whatever, it's oftentimes the case is that in-game leaders or the more cerebral players in the teams, they want as much feedback as they can get. They want other people's perspectives, a fresh set of eyes, the kind of things that a coach would bring in certain senses in terms of the man management aspect of being a coach or being someone who can coordinate with the leader. And they'll reach out to you and they'll try and pick your brain and they'll say, what do you think about this? Or they'll be making a roster move. Or what do you think if we remove this player? Here's some of the issues we've been having. What would you think if we were to add a player like this? Or who would you add if you could, if money was no object? Or if you could pick two players from this squad, which two do you think would fit us the best and what kind of role? These guys actually often like to take in as much info as they can like that. And as much as people might think we're just doing it for show on camera, there's a lot of pros out there who are interested in having this kind of insight, because who else is watching all the matches? Us. We're doing it literally for a job. So I can definitely see why teams out there have been interested, have been courting him over whatever time period they may indeed have been courting him. So the thing about Janko is he absolutely knows more about the game than the majority of pro players playing. In fact, in this team in MiBR, I'm going to go ahead and say it right now, I think he knows more about CSGO as a professional level game than everyone in the team except maybe Fallen, because at least Fallen, as a tactician, as someone who studied the demos, has brought people up and trained them, he might have maybe overall more knowledge. Even then, I think Janko knows more than Fallen about the scene and the esports side of CS in terms of knowledge, rather than Fallen. Now, Fallen might know more about the specific game and being an in-game leader and specifically what he does with his team and some of their tendencies, certainly. Because here's the part people don't understand. It's why I play with it because I think it's fun. But I think it's actually kind of silly generally to discuss who has more knowledge or whatever. Because yes, you could obviously objectively, if you could somehow measure it, which you can't, you could say this person has more total knowledge. But the problem with that is people view that concept in a linear fashion, as though if you have 90% of the knowledge of CSGO, this is just a hypothetical example, and I have 70% of the knowledge of CSGO, people act as though, as we go up the percents, it's linear. And so, for example, you having 90% means you have all of my 70% and 20% more. That's the flaw with the logic. That's the fallacy. Because obviously, the knowledge that exists in the scene, first of all, no one person can have all the knowledge. So part of it's emerging now, part of it's changing now, part of the things that we thought were true and held to be the case at the moment are going to turn out to be wrong when we actually apply them in the game tomorrow when they were right today or effective today. But more importantly, there's such a breadth of knowledge and depth of knowledge all across the scene and with different players and styles and history and all the rest of it, that even if you know 90% and I know 70%, I might actually know some things about CS that you don't know. And likewise, you knowing 90% might know a lot of the things I know, but you might have missed a few things. And I might know 70%, but actually you might still know all the 30% that I don't know. Even though you're not at 100%, I'm at 70%. That's one of the things people never understand. It's when I've said this in AMAs before, that because I've watched probably every big pro match ever, there are certain things I know about Counter-Strike that many pro players don't know and maybe never will know. Now, in terms of being an actual pro player, and more specifically, being them and in their team and playing against that opponent in that game, I can never know some of the things that they know. Even if they tell me, I probably wouldn't fully be able to ever understand it. They couldn't even articulate some of these aspects. Some of it's actually just felt in the server. It's an experience. That's one of the interesting things. So even though coldzera as an individual and it being coldzera and his exact role in his team knows more than Janko will ever be able to know about Counter-Strike, Janko knows things about Counter-Strike and has seen things about Counter-Strike that coldzera doesn't know and himself will never know. He doesn't have the time to. Logistically, he doesn't have the time to study the game like that. Someone like Janko has been watching all the top games for the last few years, has been going through demos with standalone players, with demo UI, watching them back, watching for smokes, watching for flashes, picking up on player tendencies. Most pro players are focused on themselves and getting themselves to a high level. And that's such a hard level, a hard job, that a lot of them are just going to even have to stop there. They're going to have to put most of their time into that. Then, in the team context, they're working with their teammates and they're working on things. Then they're getting some scouting reports and feedbacks from opponents, on opponents rather, and how they're going to play this particular match. But they don't have the time, for example, all the star players, to study in the same way that the in-game leader does. And likewise, they're definitely not going to have the time, as well as doing all their work and their study and their prep, to go and watch all the games that are just other teams playing. Not even teams they might even play themselves, just tier 2 teams that one day they could face one day, or teams at a tournament that they're not attending. And you know what? They have a week off, so they actually take a fucking break, take a little breather, have a day off, etc. They're not obliged to, and so they actually haven't watched all these things. So Janko comes in with a different knowledge base, with a fresh set of eyes, his own philosophy, and that's why I think this is an interesting move, actually. Because obviously, this guy is someone who has a long history, not only as an analyst and being around the scene and being able to talk to players, but he was a pro player himself. Now, pro in a very loose sense. Within Serbia and within the ex-Yugoslavia area, he was a pro player. But not on any kind of top level, not with any top finishes. He went to a few tier 1 lands, some dream hacks, etc. But he wasn't going deep beyond that. But he's played as a pro player. He's been in the practice games. He has been an in-game leader. So he's also someone with more of a mind for the game, which is why I think he became a fabulous analyst. He's even played with a truly great player and someone like Nico. He's been there. He's touched someone like that in his history. Yeah, pause. He's someone who, what I think is interesting about bringing him to this team is I think it's actually a pretty decent fit, because from what I know about Janko, from talking not just on air, but for hundreds of hours behind the scenes with this guy about the game, how he sees it, what he thinks of this player, whether someone... One of the great things is when you watch the game with him in the green room, we're all commenting on things. It's like watching some mad director's commentary that no one ever gets to hear. You get to see the differences that people have an opinion and what they think of a player, and whether that was the right player, whether it was fine if they lost, whether it was actually you won the round but it was a stupid player. And one of the things I'll give you some insight on, because I've been sat there in this scenario, not many other people could talk about this, is Janko generally, despite the fact when teams like Astralis are winning, he will hail them as fabulous and great tactics and stuff. He definitely has an appreciation for tactics, but Janko himself as a player and as an analyst, I'm going to speculate here, but I think it's grounded, is someone who generally does ascribe to that aggressive, I would say exploitative style of play, as in you apply pressure, you look for weakness, you find favourable matchups, and then you exploit them. You don't then sit back and wait for mistakes. You don't then play incredibly slow. You don't then just only go off like an amazing execute and try and have some like 200 IQ play. If you have the right players and you find something that's working, that's the way I see his mentality. It's like, what is working? What is effective? Like, for example, Janko's absolutely someone who's on board with force buying, and force buying very aggressively, by the way, and then playing very aggressively from that, and gambling a lot, which is obviously part of force buying, and playing the force buy money pressure game where you try to, if we win this particular round, even though it's another force buy, if we lose it, we might be in trouble for the next round after that. But if we win it, we break their economy, it changes the whole game, opens up the rest of the game, and now we've got a much better chance to win. He's someone who takes the gambles like that. So I actually see with this team, that could be very, very useful. That could be a very, very helpful, decent alignment, because you think of them as a squad, you think of players like Fur, Tarek, Stewie, even Fallen to a degree when he was at his prime in 2016 as an AWPer. These are pretty aggressive players. These are players who absolutely can trust themselves in a duel, who want to, rather than sit back and play some end game of chess where it's like, if he moves to there, then I could move here, but what does that mean? Instead, they're the guys who are like, let's press the action. let's see, is there an opening here? Is there some hesitancy from them? Then let's push the game at them. Let's take the game to them. Let's create pressure. Let's make them have to be on their heels the whole game. Let's try and gunfight and make that a way to win the game. Let's force our way back into a game. Let's force by and crush them psychologically. I even think these are players who will actually feed off his mentality for the game and the way he generally sees the game. Like, that's one of the reasons why you don't... He'll certainly criticise FaZe Clan, all the iterations of them, when they lose, but when you see them doing that super aggro, loads of force buys, trying a very, very aggressive style of play, he's on board with it. That's kind of the vision for the game I see him as having generally, and I think he will bring to this squad. I also think, interestingly enough, as someone who's obviously been able to go back and forwards with him a lot over vetoes, I think in terms of veto ideas, it's going to be interesting to see what he does with this squad. Because obviously coming in, they don't have a fantastic veto. He's going to have time to work with them over the break, obviously. But I would actually describe, despite how I said the style that I think he likes and the type of player I think Janko likes. In fact, I actually think generally, by the way, Janko's the kind of guy who doesn't really like sort of, like, don't take this personally, but he doesn't generally sort of, let me see, how would you describe, gravitate towards the devices of the world. He doesn't necessarily like the more passive players or the players who, like, they're solid and all around, but if you put them in like a big pressure moment, maybe they'll break, or they kind of wait for you more rather than be decisive themselves. He's more on the side of like, no, let's play like men, let's play like warriors, like let's go in there, let's go out on our shield if we're going to lose, let's play like fucking ballers. That's his style. What's funny is, despite that, and obviously by that ties into someone like a Nico, Olaf Meister, if you go back and you talk about vetoes, though, I actually think this is an interesting detail. If you go and look at Janko's history, is that actually this is where we're kind of inverted, because I kind of like the tactical style. You create opportunities by making other people make more mistakes than you, and then you capitalize on those and you make the correct play from it, which, by the way, is requires a lot more team intelligence and people understanding their roles, because if you mis-execute that, you will actually fuck up the whole style. Whereas playing aggressively comes with its own natural advantage of surprise factor. You just make it about skill. You brute force the game. You narrow down the number of options and variables. But anyway, we actually are kind of flipped when it comes to the vetoes. If you notice, generally, I think teams should, after a few times of playing an opponent in official matches, because you play them in scrims as well if they're from the same region, you should already have a pretty good sense of, if we play this map 10 times, who's going to win it 6 or more times. And if the answer isn't you should now be looking in the map pool for potential other maps. Either a punish, like they're going to leave this up because they think it's not your best map, and it isn't, but you know what? You've calculated, actually, you're a bit better on that, and maybe you've secretly prepped it more than they have. So when they leave it up as like your third worst map, actually you're going to go right into it and say, well, you know what, it's actually one of your worst maps, and so I'm going to say I'm going to make you play it. So either next time you have to ban it and give me the veto advantage, because I love to have veto advantage, that's why I have a big admirer and I have similar philosophy when I've talked to him with Carrigan in terms of his map vetoes. But generally, I think in the past, SK has been more of a team where it's like we go into our strengths. Now, Janko, I think, is actually kind of like between the two. For me, in terms of the map veto, he's kind of semi-conservative. Like, generally, he wants to pick maps that his team's really strong on, regardless of the strength of the opponent, unless there's a massive mismatch. And obviously, if you have players like MiBR has, in theory, there shouldn't be a massive mismatch in terms of talent. And he's more along the lines of, even if they're on paper slightly better in the world on this map, if it's really our best map, it's one of our best maps, it's a map we're really comfortable on, then we're just going to have to out-execute them. We're going to have to play better than them on it. We're going to have better individual performances. I think he's more of that kind of guy. So I want to see, on the one hand, because while I think he's going to embrace a lot of the aggressive qualities that some of these players have and put them in key roles to play up-tempo, fast, force-buy, aggressive Counter-Strike, I think in the veto, they're going to have to make that style work, because I don't think actually that he's going to be taking loads of gambles in the veto, especially not early on, because obviously his team isn't really equipped to do so, quite frankly. I don't really know what he'd do if he had the FaZe clan with Alu and Keo that had a very deep map pool, or the current Astralis where you can do a lot of things. Maybe with those teams he would fit himself more to the personnel. Now, I also think it's pretty cool that he's becoming a coach, because it means finally he can put his own skin in the game, as it were, to quote my man Taleb. Because it's all well and good criticising really harshly, as he should, by the way, with his role as one of the masterminds of the game on the analysis desk, a team like FaZe Clan, for example, the current FaZe Clan with Olafmeister, for all those tournaments where they were in the semis, they were in the finals, they were the better team, they were favoured, they had the map pool for them, they were in position to win, and they blew it. It's all well and good tearing those guys apart, saying what they did wrong, like saying, with all this talent, like you failed, like you should have been better, you should have played like men, you should have played a better game, like I can't believe they've broken down. It's all well and good saying all that, but then when you're in position with comparable talent, with truly great players, coldzera, Fur, Fallen, when you've major winners, every player in the team's won a major, it's all well and good if when you get in the position where you can do that, you're unable to figure out how to get your players over the hump, how to prepare them to be able to win in a big match, how to prepare them in a late game scenario they've never seen before, or how to execute down the stretch. This is one of the cool areas where we actually get to see a guy put his money up where his mouth is and go and play and actually, coach in this sense, go and actually see if he can really make the difference in that respect and if players will listen to him. So one of the things I think about this is, with all that said, this is a very tough job. I mean, it's one that has a massive upside. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a team this bad that has this many good players. It's actually outrageous how few top placings they've had with this level of talent. So on the one hand, it's got a massive upside because it's got all this talent, but they've made it clear they don't know how to make it work. And even a legendary in-game leader like Fallen can't make it work. And even coldzera, sometimes playing amazingly like he was earlier in the year, can't make it work. So at this point in time, not everyone's shit out of luck. Everyone's got no answers left. So if Janko can come in, due to the fact there's so much talent, the sky's the limit. It's possible to be a truly great team. And obviously, he will get a lot of credit, rightfully so, you would imagine, if he's able to then go ahead and do so, make that talent into a killing machine that's actually a beast in the server and has a coherent style and a good map pool and knows how it's playing and has plays that make sense and aren't just individuals doing stuff haphazardly without coordination. So I think that while it's far from clear there'll be success with this team, like I still think this is a lineup that's actually very flawed. I personally still think they're a player from being a really good team, an elite team. I think they can just be, if they get things together, I think they can be a very good team. They could be like the fourth best team in the world. I don't think they're going to become a number one team personally with this lineup. If Janko does it, I'll give him massive credit for exceeding my expectations of what's possible. But with the talent, the upside's clearly massive. And is the downside that big? I mean, I already think this team could fail, already has failed to some degree with its past lineup. I don't think we'd really blame him that much if it didn't work out. So I even think it's like a fairly good time to come in. You kind of buy in low with the potential to sell high soon if it works out. So I will say, as much as Janko's got the mind for it, he's got the talent for it here, there's the potential, I do think that he is going to find a few months into coaching this team that it's a lot more frustrating doing this particular job than he maybe idealized or hoped for, because he's going to have to deal with big egos, players where he knows they're fabulous players, but guess what? They know that. And so sometimes they don't want to do things you say, or they'll half-heartedly do it and then say it didn't work, or they'll do it up to a point and then they'll stop doing it in the match and they'll go, I thought to do something else. And you're trying to work with these guys, players who make habitual mistakes. And the reason why I say habitual there is because there are certain things that you can coach a guy and you can get on a chalkboard with him, you can go into a demo with him, you can talk about him after a smaller game, but in a big pressure match, in a big moment, is he going to actually change up what he does? Can he break the habit? Can he imprint a new habit? That requires like some very nuanced psychological understanding of how to connect with people, how trying to understand and visualize how they see the game and then translate and articulate how you see the game, hopefully make a connection with them, the ability to educate them, to actually lead them to water and make them drink, as it were. I mean, you can't make them drink. You lead them to water and hopefully they drink. That's the point. You want them to want to drink. And that's what you're trying to set up. But the psychological aspect of coaching, that's very, very tough. And that's the reason why the Jose Mourinhos of the world make many, many $1 million. And it's not just because they can draw the X's and O's of what you should do. It's can they actually get something over to that guy that actually works in a game. I don't know personally his educational ability in that sense. I know if he's talking to me, he could explain things fantastically. I could ask the right questions. Can he translate it to every player? Can he get through to Stu 2K? Is Tarek going to understand what he's talking about relative to what he wants coldzera to do? This is one of the things I think is pretty interesting. Now, in terms of his analysis role, which presumably now he's going to be vacating, I think in theory he could still do some events, especially if MiBR is not going to be at the events. Or to be fair, they get invited to everything at the moment. They're kind of the Virtus Pro of this year. But likely he's going to be full-time doing this role. So I'm going to assume even if MiBR isn't at the event, he's probably not going to work most of these because he's going to have to be spending most of his time. I do think that this is probably not necessarily a long-term role. It's probably like you try this, you see if it works. If it does, great, then continue on, become one of the all-time great coaches, do some great things with his team. If it doesn't work out, he could very easily come back. I mean, it's not, yes, he'd have to like pick up the slack of the games he wasn't watching that weren't involving his team or opponents that he was scouting specifically, but he could very quickly do that. And he's got the skill set to be one of the best immediately as soon as he comes back. And in fact, his experience, he can come in with insights into those players specifically in the matches they were in and some pretty cool stories as well. So I even think he could be a better analyst after the fact when he knows more from the direct being behind the guys in the server, knowing what led up to them doing certain moves and mistakes. And obviously he'd have amazing scouting info on the actual players in MiBR, wouldn't he? And by the way, I for one will with a heavy heart happily accept the Skrilla and spots at some of the tier 1 tournaments that I wasn't doing until recently, and some of them that I didn't get invited to. So that's a real shame. And, you know, I wish it wasn't the case, but I will bear that burden heavily. And so I hope Janko does well. I think he's a fabulous mind for the game. I certainly won't blame him if this doesn't work out. It's a tough move because it's not certain that this will work out. This isn't like becoming the coach of FaZe Clan saying, right, let's get all of Maestro on board. Oh, we're already there in the finals. Great. Now we just win tournaments. There's a lot to be done here, a lot to be shaped and crafted and thought about with the squad. But the upside's there, and I think they've got the man for the job.
This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Daniel Yordanov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Robert Baxter and Travis Greb, with a special thanks going out to Jerky's Minion. Want teasers for my upcoming content? To ask a question for my monthly AMA? How about taking part in a discussion with me about esports? Or perhaps you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Become a part of the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.